Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Jack Segal, co-chair of the International Affairs Forum, and I'll be your host for this discussion. Karen Puschel, also an IAF co-chair, is at the controls. Our guest today is Brian McCall. Brian is an instructor of history and political science at the Interlochen Arts Academy and adjunct professor at Northwestern Michigan College and First State University. Brian is a graduate of Strathclyde University in Scotland and Central Michigan University. Brian also happens to be a leading scholar on the history of Europe, particularly 20th century history. And we've had the great fortune to have recorded 5 previous shows with him dealing with World War I and Germany. Today we turn our attention to the political developments that led to the rise of fascism and Adolf Hitler in Germany. Brian McCall, welcome to Beyond the Headlines.
Welcome, Jack.
Great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Brian, where to start? I mean, when we last left this topic, we were in post-war Germany, and the situation had developed which really set the stage for the rise of something in Germany. Could you tell us a bit about that situation at the time?
After the Versailles Treaty, in effect, put all the blame for World War I and all of the damages and liabilities and reparations on the Germans, there was a very, very deep feeling of resentment that got generated in German culture and politics about the fact that they were the ones left holding the bag and the bill for all of the damage of the war. They just, at a basic level, felt that was inherently unfair. That's not to say that the Germans were not instrumental, as we've talked about in these earlier programs, in the events that led to World War I, and perhaps because of the way that they fought it, made it worse than it needed to be. Who knows? But the end result was they were the ones blamed for the war. And on top of the blame and all of the emotional baggage that came with it, was this gigantic bill. Huge, unbelievably large payments for war reparations for France, for England, for everybody that felt that they had been wronged by Germany's involvement in World War I. And the Germans were broke, like everyone else was at the war, with the exception of the United States, and they had no ability to pay. After kind of hemming and hawing for a while about how to make these payments to fulfill their treaty obligations, they began to turn on the printing press and print money in ever-increasing amounts, triggering this wave of hyperinflation, which really skyrocketed in 1923. And by the end, it was some fantastic, huge amount of $1 equaled 5 trillion marks or some crazy amount. The result of this policy was very, very, very important if you want to look about where did the Nazis draw their strength from. The people this affected the worst, in terms of maybe not in their pocketbook, but in terms of their self-identity, were German working middle-class people. Middle-class people in particular. Imagine you're a small business owner in Germany, and you do not have land and title, and you have never, you built your business with your own 2 hands, as you would have seen it back then. It was something a little akin to the way a lot of Americans think of themselves as entrepreneurs. And then your total wealth has been liquidated and eliminated. And the money that you've made from your business has been turned into paper money, which is now worthless. For middle-class people, the psychic damage that this caused is hard to imagine and measure. Poor people were in terrible condition during this whole period, but they had been in terrible condition during the war as well. And that fall was relative. And when you fall from middle-class status to destitution for many of these people, that was a terrible, terrible thing for them to handle.
Now, there was an elite class, a landowning class, and this included, as I understand, a lot of the military leadership as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So they were still around. How are they planning to run the country now that they were defeated? They were one of the 4 empires that had disappeared.
The demobilized soldiers went home and had to feel the strange reaction on the part of the German populace, who had in effect been lied to for about 4 years total of how Germany was doing in the war. When the German army surrendered, and that's what they did when they asked for the armistice in November of 1918, this shocked people at home, and for some in the German army who had not been on the front lines, who had, for example, on the Western Front, but had been on the Eastern Front, also a shock. They'd defeated the Russians.
Mm-hmm. The Russians were dropped out of the war.
They had defeated them at almost at every single instance, and had forced the Tsar to abdicate, that caused the Bolshevik Revolution. The German army in the East was wildly successful, and the feeling that the German army in the West had surrendered to the Americans, the British, and the French, it just didn't add up in many people's heads. And so the German army had to come home and try to explain this, and the best way to explain it was to not take the blame themselves, but blame it on socialists, communists, and agitators who had, in effect, weakened the will of the people at home to cause the surrender. Totally absolute bald-faced lie, but that's what they decided to do.
Now this can get somewhat confusing. We have socialism, communism, and National Socialism. We talk about the Nazis, and that's an abbreviation of the National Socialism. What are these isms? How do they differ?
The socialists were, at this point in the end of World War I, feeling vindicated about their understanding of the way that the world economy should work. They saw capitalism, in effect, almost commit suicide during World War I. Their belief was that the governments of the world would work together or cooperate together, but from a position within a national government to coordinate the economic development of the country. And the big difference between socialism and communism, as they were practiced and understood at this time and till this day, is that the socialists, in effect, said to the voters of, they believe in democracy, they said to the voters of these countries, if you don't like socialism, vote us out of office. If you like it, keep us in power. But we will have regular elections to measure whether or not this system of having more central control over the government will work. The communists believed that the common people weren't ready to accept socialism in this way, and the only way that they would accept it is if it was forced upon them, and then they could eventually see how great of a system this would be. But there's very little in communist literature about democracy. They don't believe in it. They believe that people are too easily manipulated. In fact, they wanted to do the manipulating to put their own system in place. So I guess if you're having this conversation with somebody, communism and socialism, the easiest thing to do with communism, think of it as a forced version of socialism. That once you're down this road, you're never going to have, bar violent revolution, a return to democracy. It's socialism without democracy.
So in the other end of the spectrum would be what we might call social democracy, social democrats in Europe, or maybe even Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. He's made no...
He says he's a socialist, democratic socialist, or something like that.
And you have a lot of government control over the economy. The challenge, if you're from a capitalist point of view, is that capitalists, in effect, believe that money will find a way to travel across national borders, and if somebody decides to set up a socialist state, unless you can prove that the returns are better, a lot of capitalists will start to disinvest from a country like that.
Now here comes a political movement in post-war Germany with all this destitution and inflation and disruption, and they call themselves National Socialists. Who were these people that kind of rose up out of nowhere?
Classical version of a National Socialist at the time that the party was founded in 1921, 22 is a small artisan, like a shoe repair person, or somebody who owned a small business like a locksmith, that worked for themselves, had built a reputation and a sense of decency they would have for themselves as they saw themselves, and had been economically not rich but self-sufficient. They felt that they had their own efforts had gotten to them to this point. And then the inflation had wiped them out. The belief that other international forces or groups within the country were conspiring against these people in the face of, in one way of looking at this is explaining international capitalism was controlled by Jews. That's the way a lot of these people wanted to view that. And that forces within the society like labor unions and maybe journalists and academics and people who have a lot of at stake at trying to beat down people who work for themselves, they're working together in a deep conspiracy to go after people like this poor shoemaker or a locksmith, et cetera. Those are your classic people that form the basic building, the basic early membership of the Nazi Party. They'll branch out later, but it's like a not working class, but petite bourgeoisie, I guess is the best way to describe these people in a French way. Is small.
The artisan class,
Yes.
small businesses. And there was competition for their support. There was something called the Brown Shirts,
Right.
and there were the National Socialists. What were the main movements?
Most of these at this time, because of the atmosphere that the Treaty of Versailles had created, were looking for someone to blame. And so when you want to kind of like classify who do they blame first, the Jews always ended up at the top of most of these groups' list, even though in real numbers, in no time did the Jewish population of Germany ever exceed more than, I think, 3 to 4%. They are enemy number one. And then, as I said, these groups that follow underneath them, who, their racial identity may not be as important as their occupation and their ideology. Brown shirts saw that they could use violence systematically to intimidate people who were in their way and perhaps would fight for them for power. They will come out of the Nazi movement later. There were a group of people a group of men who formed organizations called the Free Corps right in the aftermath of World War I, who took returning World War I German soldiers and signed them up for these like part-time militias. And they got to maybe steal some of the guns that they were bringing back and hold on to some ammunition and keep some uniforms that are not German army uniforms, but paramilitary uniforms, and use this military fraternity that they built in the trenches and then use it for political power later.
So there are people organizing themselves. In the political side of the equation, there is a government.
There is.
And who is running the government at this stage?
After after 1918, when the Tsar abdicated, a social democratic government took power, held power long enough to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. And formed after this immediate period, 1919, the Weimar Republic, based in the little town in Germany on the eastern side called Weimar. The Weimar Republic had some help from Americans in writing their constitution and some of their institutions that they were going to put in place. But if you look at the long scope of German history, going back to the Roman period and beyond, there are very few examples of places in Germany that had anything remotely close to what we would recognize as some form of representative or otherwise democracy. It was an alien concept to most Germans. Other parts of the world around there, you would have seen this in different places. Probably the most recent would have been something akin to like a council form of government in Switzerland. Different parts of Germany may have had like a benign duke or baron running the place with a more of an open-handed feel towards his subjects to let them say what they thought about how he was running it. But you would have not seen representative assemblies, regular elections, a free press. These things just never existed.
I mean, the Allies had imposed a sort of weak structure for Germany as a whole with
you use the word imposed.
Yeah.
That's a really, there's probably not enough scholarship on how much influence the British, the French, and the Americans, who were dealing with their own aftermath of World War I, had in setting up what you'll call a post-war German government. From what I know about this, it was not a particularly heavy hand. Very different than what you'll see in the aftermath of World War II, where the Federal Republic of Germany is pretty much created by the United States and the Allied powers. Here's what your government is going to be. I don't think it was that detailed of what happened in Germany and Weimar. They have a new representative democracy. Now, they had elections. Let's make sure I don't misspeak here. They had elections in Germany before World War I. They had a Reichstag. But the Kaiser ruled Germany. He ruled it through the Reichstag, but he ruled Germany. The Reichstag had power as much as the Kaiser would allow it to have power. And he could manipulate it and reject its laws whenever he felt that it wasn't helpful to him. He could work around it. Before that, we talked about earlier, when we talked about these countries, Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, basically runs the Reichstag as his own personal instrument. And
so these are not extremely democratic models to run a country on.
They've got the structures,
Yeah.
but you couldn't compare like the French Assembly of the Third Republic to the German Reichstag. It doesn't work. You can't compare Parliament, and you certainly couldn't compare Congress. Maybe a closer example would be what Tsar Nicholas set up in the years before the Revolution with the Duma, which is an elected assembly, but without a lot of power.
It's sort of a puppet regime. Now, the Weimar Republic is in operation. We're having regular elections, and
Right.
But there you have a weakness in the leadership at the top. What's going on there?
And you have a succession of the wrong people at the wrong time. There's only one really effective prime minister or chancellor of Germany in the run-up to the rise of the Nazis, and that would have been Albrecht, I believe is how you pronounce him. He was a relatively successful chancellor. The period of after the hyperinflation is controlled in 1923, thanks to the intervention of the United States. We gave the Germans a plan called the Dawes Plan, where we in effect loaned Germany or gave them credit, which they could use to pay the reparations to the French and the British, who in turn could take their money that they owed us for the debt that they had incurred with us during World War I. They could pay us, and we could then get the international currency markets moving again. That's what happened in 1923,
That
24.
sounds like it doesn't help the average German citizen at all.
It actually did,
because
in
the
the sense
inflation
that
was
the
bigger.
inflation began to go down.
Yeah.
They printed new Reichsmarks, which had less, which didn't become as inflationary. People who had lost their whole life savings had to start over. That's the truth.
And there
But
wasn't that much damage to Germany itself
physically,
during the war?
no.
No.
I mean, there was a lot of deprivation with food shortages, but you know, occasionally the Allies floated a few gigantic bombing planes over and dropped a couple hundred tons of bombs, but nothing like what will happen in World War II.
Now this guy Hitler comes along, and he's a World War I veteran, wounded, got a couple medals, I understand.
Yep.
He starts to agitate, and as quickly ends up in jail.
Right.
How did they already saw him as a problem?
The story of Hitler is the great, one of the things I had for our questions today is how important is Hitler today?
Yeah.
It is one of the most bizarre set of coincidences and circumstances that leads itself. I think one of the things that's so challenging about Hitler in any serious way of looking at it is he's so ripe for counterfactuals. There's what would have happened had he been taken out in various ways or diverted.
If you rewrote the history, what would have happened?
It's a staple now in 21st century America. You
Yeah.
hear it all the time.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that there are enormous numbers of times where he could have been sidetracked, dead, put in some other kind of situation where he wouldn't have been a political agitator. It's an endless list. Close calls, unbelievable number of close calls where he should have been dead, didn't die. The most amazing is his World War I service, where he was in a regiment of, I think, 1,300, and he was one of 3 survivors. But his role as an agitator is quite interesting. He found out very quickly, not while he was in the war, but after the war, after he got out of the hospital, he finds out about Versailles in a hospital, that he could speak very, very effectively and persuasively.
Although not a highly educated man and a
Hardly.
corporal in the army.
He was a homeless bum for
Yeah.
much of his youth, lived in flop houses. You know, the famous story, of course, that he's rejected from the Arts Academy in Vienna. You know. But this ability to speak and this ability to persuade people, as you know, in running the International Affairs Forum and other venues, people who have this, it is not, you can teach effective public speaking, but some people really just have it. And they can really magnetize and just energize a crowd of people. Hitler, for whatever reason, had that quality. I don't want to think we should use the word gift, but he had that quality. And he didn't really use it until after the war. And then his ability to get people to listen to him and then identify with what he's talking about. So he moves way past the someone who would be like a carnival barker, I guess, or you know, it's the equivalent of stopping to look at a car accident. You're gawking at him. He gets people engaged in what he says, and there aren't very many politicians of any country of any history that have that ability.
What was he saying? What was the main themes of his message to the working class, to the underclass that he was talking to?
If you were going to wrap it up into a few short sentences, it's not your fault. It's the Jews. And
not the elite, not the business community other than the Jews.
he criticizes them. He does not feel that they have had Germany's interest in their. He always comes back to Germany. Ironically, of course, he's not a German citizen. He's an Austrian.
Yeah.
He doesn't get German citizenship until 1932, so he could qualify to be president. He's an Austrian during all of this time. But by constantly going back to the nation and then the people who represent that nation, reaching out to his audience, men and women. One of the interesting things about Hitler is he's one of the first modern politicians, and he was a politician, who constantly thinks about appealing to women as well as men. Women had the right to vote in post-war Germany. And they always had the right to influence their husbands or their men in their lives. So this ability to speak to people in a way that feels like they're with him, it's incredibly powerful. And it must have had an enormous impact on where he had always thought his place in the world was, and then starting to see that actually happen. That's a very, very interesting couple of things that happen at the same time. So much so that he convinces 2,000 people in Munich in the fall of 1923 that they can, by will alone and a few pistols, take over the government of the state of Munich, of Bavaria, and then cause a revolution in all the other states of Germany and take over all of German power. He really got people to believe that, and they march out.
So this was a proposal for a revolutionary path to power, not a system of democratic
And he had
election.
a model.
Yeah.
The model he's following had happened a year before in Rome with Mussolini, who in effect did what Hitler tries to do in Munich. The March on Rome, which didn't involve that many people, a couple of thousand black shirts, again using the uniforms, the language of fascism. Fascism at this point is not really fully formed as an alternative to socialism and communism, but people are talking about it. The idea of a strong leader, obedience, racial purity, militarism. This stuff is all, Mussolini's playing with this and uses it. And by 1922, he makes his way to Rome, convinces the Roman king, the Italian king to, in effect, make him dictator, for lack of a better term. Serving under the king of Rome, the king of Italy never went away during Mussolini's reign, but as in effect, the head chancellor for life of the Italian state.
So Hitler's got that model in
does.
mind, but this is before or after he went to prison and he wrote Mein
This is
Kampf.
before.
Uh-huh.
He also has, he read newspapers from around the world. What's happening in China in the late 1920s? Different warlords have carved out areas of China that they're running on their own. Maybe that's what he was imagining for Bavaria for himself. The Western powers by the early 1920s look quite, the devastation of World War I affected everyone terribly. And parliamentary democracy in England, the French were a mess for a variety of reasons. The number one is that they'd lost a third of their young men. There's a lot of evidence around, and what did Lenin pull off? Different philosophy, but same principle. Limited number of people, very focused, push over a weak government, you're in charge. So he tries to do that, and it fails. It fails miserably. The Munich police did not play the role that he thought they would. He thought that they would join him, that they felt that it's time to bust up this terrible system, and instead they lock arms against him. Shots are fired. It's a little like Lexington and Concord. We don't know who fired the first shot. Most of the dead are Nazis, including the one standing next to Hitler. They were locked arms like this. And the guy next to him, I always
Another missed opportunity. Yeah.
on my whiteboard, I always write. I take a ruler and put 18 inches, and it's the distance between the bullet that killed the man next to Hitler and where Hitler was. He runs away. He's arrested, goes on trial, and then takes the trial and turns it into a fantastic propaganda opportunity. Had the people running Bavaria had been a little more brutal, they probably could have picked him up the day that he was arrested, put him against a wall and have him shot by a firing squad and been done with it. Dealt with the fact that that might have been a really arbitrary way of dealing with this, but then he would have been forgotten. That's not what they did.
We'll go back to what happens, what he does in prison and after that. Let me just remind our viewers that you're watching Beyond the Headlines. I'm your host, Jack Segal, and we're talking to Brian McCall, an instructor in international relations and history at the Interlochen Arts Academy, and an expert on European history, particularly in the 20th century. Brian, we have now Hitler in jail, and he famously writes Mein Kampf, which translates as My Struggle, roughly speaking.
But during the trial, though, before he goes to jail, every German newspaper covered this trial. And they reported to their readers what Hitler's saying. And Hitler had, in effect, he waived his right to a lawyer and acted as his own defense, which in effect meant he had unlimited amount of time to make his case for himself and National Socialism. And he flipped the charges onto the courts and the government and said, you are responsible, not me, for the disaster that our country is. I acted. You are the problem, not me. And this went on and on and on. So at the end of the trial, the court has the decision to make. Should we make a martyr of him, or should we lock him up for a little while and hopefully he'll disappear and that'll be the end of him? They picked B. Instead of locking him up for 25 years, they give him 9 years, of which I think he served less than a year of that, 9 months in prison.
Yeah, and I read that he complained that he had a desk and typewriter and everything, and he complained there were too many visitors.
He had a lot of visitors.
They cut back on visitors, yeah.
But his big realization during prison is something that I put in a quote for our notes for today, and it goes like this, quote, and this is out of Mein Kampf, "Instead of working to achieve power by an armed coup, we shall have to hold our noses and enter the Reichstag against the Catholic and Marxist deputies. If outvoting them takes longer than outshooting them, at least the results will be guaranteed by their own constitution. Any lawful process is slow, but sooner or later we will have a majority. And after that, Germany." My initial question for today was, how important is Hitler today? And that quote that he writes while he's in prison is one of the ones that I probably, of some version of this, should make his story relevant if you want to believe in representative democracy. The trouble, of course, is if you believe in representative democracy, should you allow people to run in democratic elections whose main goal is to end democracy? Now, Hitler didn't advertise widely that his goal was once he had power, he would never relinquish it, but he also never hid it either.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have a lot of rightist, right-wing parties in Europe that are gaining strength in Europe, particularly with the influx of refugees and the whole issue of instability in Europe or destabilizing Europe. Do you see a link between these new parties or these growing parties and this kind of ideology that Hitler was talking about?
Anytime you have a political movement based on scapegoating, everyone's red flag should go up.
Mm-hmm. So whether it be Jews or Mexicans, huh?
Or any group.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always concerned when the point of a political party is to cast blame on other people than themselves for the cause of whatever collective problems we have. And the idea that you can use democratic systems to end democracy, it is I think, the thing that Hitler probably it was sort of like he opened up a box and, whoa, wait a minute. We'll have an election. Eventually, my side will win, and that will be the last election. In fact, he even, to cap it off, after he had taken power legally, not by elections, but by appointment, decides to have a plebiscite, a referendum, an election in which everyone in Germany was asked, do you like me or not? Should we keep me in power forever or not? Of course, the results were 90% yes. I've always been interested in the 10% of people who voted no.
So in the last, we got 15 minutes left, so let's walk him through how he actually takes power, though. He's out of prison now, and he's got this following, and he's got this ideology.
He built one of the most modern political parties in Western history, and that includes the United States. The first politician to campaign by air. Instead of driving around in a bus, he bought a Fokker triplane and flew around Germany, landed. He would give sometimes 10 speeches a day because of the speed that he could travel from place to place. Coordinated the Nazi parties in all over Germany, become connected by telephone, telegraph. They build and buy printing plants. They start to have very uniform propaganda, very centralized messaging. So you could be from the north to south, the east to west of Germany, and pretty much read the same thing from the Nazis across all of the country. He founds magazines, newspapers. At this time in the 20s, the radio is not a big tool for him. It will be later, after he takes power. But initially, using the printed word, his plane, his organization, he builds a very modern political party. And they did polling. They found out what people liked. When he would go to speak at places, he would know the local issues, like dairy prices or taxes or imports.
Did they already have the uniforms and the banners or the swastika was all coming in?
If you see early photos of the Nazis in like the early 20s, it's very hit and miss and a lot of homemade things. By 1925, 26, they're all pretty much wearing standardized uniforms. The banners and all of the pageantry that the Nazis are rightly famous for comes out of that period. And it's used so effectively. He wanted to have every tool from mass media that you could get in the late 1920s, he wanted to use, and does.
He hires one of the most brilliant directors, Leni Riefenstahl.
Fritz Lang turned him down, but that was after he took power. He doesn't start making movies until after he's Chancellor.
Okay.
But the idea that you can use technology to make your party more widespread and broad-based and uniform, that's very modern. And so you could say a lot of Democratic precinct captains could have learned a lot from watching Hitler operate in the late 20s.
So how does he become the second most important man after von Hindenburg?
The old president,
Chancellor,
yep,
president.
the kind of the image of old Prussian Germany.
Yeah.
There's a series of elections that happen in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash. And if there's one event that you
So
could
we're
say
in
caused,
1929, then 1930. Yeah.
if there's one event you could say, had this not happened, had, you know, and that's another program for an economist, not for me, but had the crash of 29 not happened, with the resulting inaction of the federal government and state governments who were just, you know, legally or leadership challenged, Nazis and Hitler would be a footnote in history.
So they went. The German economy collapsed along with the American economy and the world economy.
From 25 to 29, Hitler builds a very strong political party, which does not do very well in national elections. But the party mechanism, the party structure, the organization is there. It's ready. He's waiting for his chance. The chance comes with the stock market crash and the resulting inaction. That is the spur for the series of elections that began in 1930, pick up speed in 1931. 1932, at one point they're having an election every 2 months to decide who's going to have it. There's no majority in the Reichstag at this time. Multiple parties competing. 37 political parties in Germany. Nobody can form a coalition that will last long enough to deal with a crisis, and let's be honest, that originated in America, really. The cause of the world trade collapse, as a result, almost every country in the world in the aftermath of the Great Depression, or of the Wall Street crash, throws up these huge tariff walls. So they quit trading with each other. That caused Germany, whose economy was being geared towards exports, sending out to their products around the world, that crashes. This gives Hitler his chance, because he could rightly say, international capitalism has failed. What then he then equates that run by the Jews. And in order for us to, and you've been asking, what's the difference between National Socialism and socialism? Capitalism and socialism share one thing. They tend to be international systems. Socialism aspires to internationalism. Capitalism, in many cases, relies on it. You have to trade. And Hitler rejects that. And National Socialism is that we're going to build socialism for only Germans, and we're going to build it so completely that we will have the greatest life in the world for only ourselves. What, of course, he does not say is that that socialist system will be built on the backs of the various nations and people that he intends to conquer and enslave. But that's going to come later. Initially, that's not part of the equation. People that voted for Hitler in the elections in 1932 did not vote for a worldwide war. They just didn't. They voted for Nazism. They didn't vote for what his plan is. And that is, there's no doubt about this. This is the plan. The plan is that Germany will be the #1 country in the world, and it will be the #1 country in the world at the expense of every other one of its neighbors, without apology, without explanation.
But he becoming more popular, or how does he gain
Well, that
power
is
in the Reichstag, in the parliament?
What happened in 1932 is so interesting. The second election the second to the last election of 32, he gets nearly 35% of the Reichstag seats, largest number of delegates, but not a majority, which means he's going to have to find another party to form a coalition with him. The natural choice, one would have thought, if he had toned down a lot of the racial stuff, might have been the Catholic center parties that were more socially conservative but not interested in all this crazy racial stuff that he had been talking about. They balk. And instead, the new government that's formed out of this second to last election says to Hitler, how would you like to be vice chancellor? We'll let you go into the executive branch of the government. You'll be vice chancellor. You'll have to work with other political party leaders, but you'll be part of the executive branch under a parliamentary system. And he rejects this. There's no way. The next election comes, the vote total goes down. Many people who had voted for the
The vote for Nazis,
the Nazis
decreases.
drops tremendously. And this is in November of 32. Somebody else gets elected in November of 32, Franklin Roosevelt. The parallels between Roosevelt, Hitler, Stalin's power is in place by 27, so, or roughly, so he comes on power a little earlier. It's so fascinating, those three individuals. But Hitler's power, it loses delegates. And that is when this incredibly fatal decision is made. At the top of the German ruling class, a former chancellor, von Papen, is angry at another former chancellor, Streicher, and to get back at Streicher, he makes a deal to go to Hitler and say, we'll let you be chancellor, even though your vote total has dropped. In order for your party to have power, you'll have to do it through us. And Streicher sells this to Hindenburg. Hindenburg is the chancellor. He's the president.
Sorry.
He can decide who the chancellor is.
Okay.
It's sort of like when the Queen of England accepts the new prime minister. You know, she always will, but in theory she could say no.
But Hindenburg is a revered figure.
Oh, very, and hates Hitler. Thinks he's a is a lower class, got a right, just terrible, beyond contempt in many cases. But von Papen convinces Hindenburg that this is going to work. And they agree to it. And they let him in as chancellor. And after he is chancellor, the door is open to power at this point, but he doesn't have complete power. Then a series of events happen that the movies about this are still not, they haven't been made. There's so many things that happen in this period that should be dramatized because it's incredible. The biggest one is the Reichstag fire. Somebody set the Reichstag on fire.
The building of the parliament is set on fire.
The equivalent of having the U.S. Capitol building burned to the ground. Communist sympathizer is caught. Who knows who really set this fire? Hitler uses this as the go button to push the terror on anyone who stands to seem to be a counter-revolution, someone who's a threat to the government. And he extends his power then. Second thing that happens, we're
around 1933.
We're in real 33 now. And the terror has been unleashed after the Reichstag fire. Hindenburg's health begins to fail, and it's getting lower and lower and lower. Hitler decides that before Hindenburg dies, that he needs to solidify his power in the Reichstag, which could theoretically still vote in laws and pass legislation and stuff. He makes the Reichstag vote for an enabling act, and the enabling act in effect says Hitler has the right to make any laws that he wants to, and we have the right to make laws that Hitler wants to. Sign here. The day that that vote happens is one of the most fascinating days. It's filmed too. There's lots of film of this. The delegates show up to the Reichstag and they're surrounded by stormtroopers. There's guns and troops and police and thugs everywhere. Some of the men, as they walked up to go in, were handed a piece of paper, small one, like a little folded note. They'd open it up and inside would be the name of their wife, their children, and their home address. And nothing else. In effect, it says, if you'd like to see these people again, you know what you need to do. If you don't vote the right way, you're not going to leave this building alive. I remember watching a film of Saddam Hussein operating inside Iraq back in the late 70s after he'd taken power, doing in effect what Hitler is doing. Hitler's not in the room when they vote for this, but what happened inside that building. People were brought outside and executed while the rest of them were still, I don't know if you've seen this film, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Incredible terror. They passed this, he now has the right to rule by decree. Hindenburg is either forced to accept this, and they have another ceremony where Hindenburg goes to the church, or the garrison church it's called in Berlin, and a big ceremony with Hitler dressed up in civilian clothes, everyone else is in uniform, and it solidifies that it looks like the Nazis now are respectable. The next step is what will happen when Hindenburg dies.
So we only have a couple minutes left. Do we want to?
We can talk about that.
Yeah, let's go there, and then that'll wrap this up for this session. Yeah.
The big question for the Nazis, after he's got the enabling lock passed, after he has the seal from Hindenburg to run Germany, is will the army, the German army, the small 100,000 man Versailles Treaty limited German army that represented a kind of an old Germany, the traditional,
Still commanded by the elite,
the Prussian officer class.
Prussian officer class.
Will they accept Hitler?
Uh-huh.
And their price for accepting Hitler is Hitler had to get rid of the leadership of the brown shirts. The head of the brown shirts is one of his oldest friends, Ernst Röhm, who conveniently enough in the aftermath was a not so closeted homosexual, which is a pretty big deal, illegal in Germany during this time, along with dozens of other people at the top of this German
And his is a competing militaristic
He's
party.
got 2 million members at this point, uniformed with pistols. They don't have any heavy weapons or tanks or anything like that. But the German army is 100,000. He's got a 2 million man private army. And they had been very useful up to the point that Hitler took power. After Hitler is in the government, there really isn't a role for them. And the army said they have to go. And they meant like leave the earth, go, not out of power. So Hitler thinks about this, gets pressure from the army to act soon. This has to be done before Hindenburg dies. And they eventually in June of 1934, he does this. And he in effect becomes like Al Capone. It's a scene out of The Untouchables. They call the stormtroop leadership together in a resort outside of Munich. They're all arrested in mass. They're arrested all over the country, actually. There were many, wherever the leadership was, the SS, not the SA, Hitler's no personal bodyguard, which is going to expand power. They arrest hundreds of these SA leaders, and without much of any pretense, just shoot them, all during the first 2 to 3 days of this beheading of this institution. Wow. 2 million people at the top of this. Their leaders are gone. That is the price that the army was exacting for them to say, okay, when von Hindenburg dies, you can collect your check. So von Hindenburg died. He was dying of cancer. The day after the funeral, and actually during the funeral, the German army assembles in mass at their barracks and depots and swears a personal oath to Adolf Hitler. Not to anything other than Adolf Hitler. Not to Germany, not to a constitution.
Just to Adolf Hitler. Well, that's a wonderful place to stop our discussion for today. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had the privilege of talking with Brian McCall, obviously, as you've learned in this past hour, an expert on European history and on German history, and just a wealth of stories and anecdotes and information, which I know we, if you'll go along with it, we'll continue this discussion.
Let's keep it going.
Okay. Thank you all for viewing today, and we look forward to the next session of Beyond the Headlines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.